The sun hung low over the Pacific, casting long shadows across a land steeped in conflict. It was early summer in 1945, and the Japanese Empire, which had once seemed invincible, was crumbling. The sound of warplanes roaring through the skies was a constant reminder of the endless battles raging from island to island. But in one particular corner of the war, a quiet yet profound shift was beginning to take place. The American forces had advanced far enough to capture prisoners from the Japanese ranks, including women who had served in auxiliary roles during the war. These female soldiers, many of whom had been subjected to extreme hardship and brutal conditions, were now at the mercy of their captors. For the first time in history, they were being taken not only as prisoners of war, but as individuals who would experience something far beyond the physical and emotional torment of captivity, an ideological transformation. In a cramped, oppressive camp on the outskirts of Okinawa, the harsh, unforgiving air was filled with the faint murmur of prisoners, many of them still clothed in tattered uniforms and sporting the dirt and fatigue of years spent fighting for their emperor. These women, who had been raised on ideals of honor and loyalty to the Japanese imperial family, now faced something they had never anticipated. The brutality of their capture was one thing. The idea of being forced to confront the very ideology they had fought for was something entirely different. As the Americans approached the task of interrogating and debriefing these women, they had a different kind of weapon at their disposal, the promise of democracy. Unlike other prisoners who had been brutalized or forced into confession, the women captured on this day would find themselves in a strange and unexpected position. They were not only prisoners, they were the first among the Japanese women who would be subjected to a sweeping cultural experiment by their captors. Forced lessons in the values of democracy and liberty. As they sat on hard benches in makeshift classrooms, the weight of their surroundings was tangible. This was not just a war. It was a battle for minds, a contest of ideologies. They were about to be presented with a new vision of the world, one that stood in stark contrast to everything they had been taught in their homeland. This was a psychological battle that went beyond strategy or tactics. It was an attempt to break down the very foundation of a worldview, to strip away the nationalism and militarism that had been instilled in these women since childhood. The classrooms were filled with a sense of quiet unease. Women who had once proudly worn their military uniforms were now wearing the gray, ill-fitting clothes of prisoners. Their once pristine hair was tangled and their expressions were vacant, some filled with fear, others with defiance. They could hardly understand what was happening. The words they were hearing were foreign, not only in language but in their very meaning. What were these strange concepts being introduced to them? Democracy, human rights, freedom of thought. How could they reconcile the teachings of Emperor Hirohito and the spirit of the imperial army with these foreign ideas? It was not just a matter of learning a new political system, it was a confrontation with everything they had known and fought for. The emotional and intellectual toll of this lesson would be profound, and the personal transformations that followed would ripple through their lives for years to come. The question remained, would these women, so deeply ingrained in the culture of the empire, be able to accept these ideas, or would they reject them, as their comrades had rejected the idea of defeat itself? The stage for this dramatic confrontation between ideologies had been set years earlier, long before the American forces had ever set foot on Japanese soil. The global conflict that had engulfed the world was not just a war for territory or resources. It was a battle for the very future of civilization, fought not only with weapons but with words, philosophies, and values. By 1945, World War II had ravaged much of the globe. The Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and the Empire of Japan, had sought to impose their totalitarian ideologies upon the world. For Japan, the path to war had begun long before the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. In the decades preceding the war, Japan had embraced a militaristic nationalism, driven by a belief in its divine destiny to dominate East Asia. The ideology of Bushido, the samurai code, and the emperor's divine status formed the backbone of this national fervor, which was stoked further by the expansionist goals of the Japanese military. In the years before their defeat, the Japanese military machine had steamrolled through China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, bringing millions of people under its control. Alongside the war machine, Japanese women were often expected to serve in auxiliary roles, whether as nurses, signal operators, or in the civilian workforce, contributing to the war effort. They were raised in an atmosphere of reverence for the emperor and the supreme authority of the state. Loyalty was paramount. Women were encouraged to view their sacrifices as a direct reflection of their honor to their nation, their emperor, and their families. Yet, as the war began to turn against Japan, the facade of invincibility cracked. The Allied forces, led by the United States, pressed forward with relentless campaigns in the Pacific. The tide began to shift in favor of the Allies, culminating in the brutal Battle of Okinawa in 1945. It was during this battle, one of the final major engagements in the Pacific, that American forces captured a significant number of Japanese prisoners, including women. The United States, having already mobilized the full might of its military, was now waging a war not only against Japan's military forces, but also against the very principles that had guided Japan's wartime actions. This was a confrontation of values. The United States was no longer just concerned with defeating an enemy. It was engaged in a larger ideological battle, one that sought to impose a different vision of the world, a vision based on democracy, individual freedom, and self-determination. The idea of imposing democracy on the defeated nations of the Axis powers was not a new one. Following the end of World War I, the Allies had attempted to reshape Europe with the Treaty of Versailles, but those efforts had been incomplete. Now, after the devastation of the Second Global Conflict, the United States and its allies were determined to not only win the war, but to fundamentally reshape the political and cultural structures of the nations that had caused such havoc. Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, was followed by a period of occupation under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, who was tasked with overseeing the rebuilding of Japan. MacArthur, a firm believer in the principles of democracy, sought to transform Japanese society from the ground up. This was not merely a military occupation. It was an ideological reformation. The American vision was clear. Japan must be remade into a peaceful, democratic nation that would never again pose a threat to global stability. For the Japanese people, this transformation would be nothing short of revolutionary. A society built on centuries of tradition, military discipline, and loyalty to the emperor was being forced to embrace values that were diametrically opposed to everything they had known. The challenge was not just military. It was cultural, psychological, and deeply personal. The women who had been taken prisoner by the Americans had been raised in this environment, and now they found themselves in the midst of an intellectual and emotional storm that would leave lasting scars. The women in the prisoner camps were not simply war captives. They were the vanguard of an experiment in re-education. The Americans knew that if they could reshape the minds of these women, they could begin to reshape the minds of Japan's entire future. For these women, the stakes were high. They were caught between their past, steeped in the values of the emperor and the empire, and their present, which was an uncertain and uncomfortable encounter with the foreign ideas of democracy and individual rights. For the female prisoners of war, the struggle to accept the American vision of democracy was not merely an intellectual one, it was profoundly personal. These women, many of whom had served in auxiliary roles, had seen the horrors of war firsthand. They had been raised in a culture that extolled the virtues of sacrifice, obedience, and unwavering loyalty to the emperor. They had been taught that their honor was bound to the success of the Japanese war machine. To question this, to even consider an alternative, was nothing short of sacrilege. As the prisoners sat in the makeshift classrooms, the walls that once seemed to imprison them physically now took on a psychological weight. The American officers who taught them were not merely giving lessons in political theory. They were attempting to dismantle the very foundation of these women's identities. The curriculum was simple in its delivery but profound in its implications. Concepts like freedom of speech, equality, and democracy were presented as the keys to a better world, a world that seemed completely alien to the women in those classrooms. At first, many resisted. Their minds, shaped by years of militaristic propaganda, could not easily accept the ideas that the Americans presented. The teachings of the emperor, the sacred bond between the Japanese people and their leader, were deeply ingrained in their hearts. The very notion that the emperor was not divine, that he was simply a man, was a blow to their sense of identity. To embrace democracy meant not only rejecting their emperor, but also rejecting everything they had been taught about their place in the world. Yet, as the days wore on, something began to shift. The women who had once sat in defiance, their eyes narrowed with suspicion and resentment, began to engage with the material. Perhaps it was the promise of freedom, or the glimmer of hope that democracy might offer them a way out of the chaos that had engulfed their lives. Some women, exhausted by years of war and suffering, began to see the merit in what the Americans were proposing. Others, disillusioned by the devastation of the war, began to question the very ideals they had fought to defend. For many, the turning point came when the Americans introduced the concept of individual rights. The idea that one's worth was not determined by one's birth or status, that a person had the right to speak freely and to shape their own destiny, was a radical notion. For women raised in a society where their primary role had been as mothers and wives, these ideas were nothing short of revolutionary. They began to see themselves not just as subservient members of society, but as individuals with agency, capable of making their own choices. In the weeks that followed, the classroom dynamic began to change. What had started as a hostile and alienating experience for the women began to evolve into something more complex. They began to ask questions, not just about the American system, but about their own country's history. They questioned the role of the emperor, the conduct of the military, and the value of the sacrifices they had made. The moral dilemmas were impossible to ignore. Had they been complicit in an unjust war? Were the lives of those they had fought against less valuable than their own? The psychological toll of this intellectual confrontation was immense. Some women broke down under the pressure, their emotional resilience shattered by the realization that they had been part of a war that had led to the deaths of millions. Others found a new sense of strength in their newfound ability to think critically about their world and their place within it. The process of re-education had begun to dismantle not only their ideological beliefs, but also their emotional attachment to a regime that had promised them honor and glory, but had instead delivered ruin. The immediate consequence of this shift was profound. These women were not just being taught about democracy, they were living it. They were being given the tools to question authority, to examine their own beliefs, and to form new identities. For many, the concept of democracy became a way of life, not just a set of political principles. It was a path to healing, to personal liberation, and to a future that had seemed unimaginable just months earlier. But this transformation was not without its challenges. There were women who rejected the lessons entirely, unable to reconcile the teachings of democracy with the values of loyalty and duty they had been raised with. For them, the process of re-education was a betrayal, a stripping away of everything they had believed to be sacred. These women clung to their past, refusing to embrace the new world that was being thrust upon them. In the end, however, the emotional and intellectual shifts that took place in those classrooms would resonate far beyond the walls of the prisoner camps. The women who embraced democracy, who learned to think for themselves, would return to Japan after the war, carrying with them the seeds of change. They would become the first generation of Japanese women to participate in a democratic society, and their experiences would help shape the post-war rebuilding of Japan. The psychological struggle was not confined to the prisoners. The American soldiers who conducted these re-education sessions were also caught in the tension between their role as captors and their desire to help these women transform. They, too, were grappling with the complexity of the situation. They were teaching an ideology that stood in stark contrast to the one these women had fought for, yet they had to maintain an empathetic approach. The pressure to be both compassionate and firm was immense, as these soldiers knew that their efforts could either facilitate Japan's post-war recovery or fuel its continued resistance. As the final days of the Pacific War drew to a close, the women who had undergone re-education under American supervision were released from the prisoner camps. They emerged into a world that was irrevocably altered, not just by the bombs that had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but by the ideological seeds that had been planted in their minds. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it without its struggles, but the experiences in those classrooms would shape the trajectory of their lives. and the future of Japan itself, in profound ways. For the women who had embraced the lessons of democracy, the aftermath of their re-education was a journey into uncharted territory. They returned to Japan in a society devastated by war, with a nation struggling to rebuild both physically and psychologically. The devastation was visible everywhere. Cities in ruins, industries shattered, and millions of lives forever changed by the horrors of war. But for these women, there was a new opportunity, the opportunity to participate in the creation of a new, democratic Japan. The immediate consequence of this ideological shift was the role these women would play in the post-war reconstruction of Japan. They would become the pioneers of a new wave of Japanese feminism and political participation. With the introduction of a new constitution in 1947, which enshrined the principles of democracy, equality, and human rights, Japanese women gained the right to vote and to take on more active roles in society. These changes, however, were not instantaneous. The conservative patriarchal structures that had long dominated Japanese society were not dismantled overnight. Yet for the women who had been exposed to the democratic ideas of the Americans, the path forward seemed clear. They would fight to have their voices heard, to contribute to the rebuilding of their nation on their terms. On the other hand, the women who resisted the teachings of democracy faced a very different future. For them, the war had not ended with Japan's surrender. It had only just begun. They struggled with feelings of betrayal and confusion, torn between the loyalty they had once felt toward their emperor and the alien ideologies they were now being asked to accept. The emotional toll was immense, as many women grappled with the trauma of having fought for a cause that was now universally condemned. They had been told that they were fighting for the glory of their nation, but now they were left to question everything they had believed in. The American re-education program had a lasting impact on Japan's society, but its legacy was not one of immediate peace and unity. In fact, the very act of forcing Japanese women to confront their nation's ideology led to a period of deep soul-searching within Japan. It became clear that the war had not only destroyed Japan's physical infrastructure, but had also fractured the very foundations of its cultural and political identity. The psychological and emotional repercussions of this transformation went far beyond the immediate aftermath of the war. The women who had experienced re-education were now left to navigate a world where their roles were no longer defined by the emperor or the militaristic ideals of their society. They were now participants in a global dialogue about democracy, human rights, and the responsibilities of citizenship. Some would embrace these values and help shape Japan's post-war identity as a peaceful democratic nation. Others would struggle with the psychological scars of war and the deep moral dilemmas that came with accepting or rejecting the lessons they had been taught. Looking back, the American decision to introduce democratic principles to the women of Japan's military ranks can be seen as one of the most fascinating, and at times controversial, elements of the occupation. The implications of this ideological experiment were far-reaching, as it forced a confrontation between two very different worldviews. On the one hand, there was the vision of a united imperial Japan where loyalty to the emperor was paramount. On the other, there was the idea of an individual's rights, freedom, and the power to influence one's own destiny. This clash was not just one of political systems, it was a clash of values that had been deeply embedded in the hearts and minds of the people involved. The lessons learned by these women, as painful and difficult as they may have been, played a crucial role in the transformation of Japanese society in the decades that followed. They helped to break down the walls of a rigid hierarchical society and paved the way for greater social mobility, political participation, and gender equality. The women who had once fought for the emperor now found themselves at the forefront of a new movement, a movement that would redefine Japan's place in the world. In the years after the war, the memory of the American re-education efforts faded into the background of Japan's rapid economic recovery and its reintegration into the global community. Yet for those who had been there, who had sat in those classrooms learning the ideals of democracy, the experience remained a defining chapter in their lives. It was a reminder of how deeply war could affect not only the physical landscape of a country, but also its very soul. The broader implications of the re-education program reached beyond Japan's borders. The United States, by focusing on ideological transformation rather than mere military victory, set a precedent for future post-conflict rebuilding efforts. The program demonstrated that winning a war was not enough. The victor also had a responsibility to reshape the culture and values of the defeated. While the success of such efforts varied, the lessons learned from this period would be applied in other contexts, from Germany's post-war reconstruction to the American involvement in the rebuilding of other war-torn nations. In the end, the story of the Japanese women who were forced to study democracy is not just a story of military defeat and re-education. It is a story of transformation, the painful, complex process of moving from one world to another, of reconciling the past with the present, and of finding new identities in the wake of profound change. It is a story of resilience, of women who faced the unbearable and emerged from it with a renewed sense of purpose and agency. And it is a reminder that the human cost of war is never limited to the battlefield. It extends into the hearts and minds of those who survive, forcing them to question everything they thought they knew.